The rain came down in violent sheets, blinding the road and tearing through the night with a merciless howl. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the desolate stretch of land that separated the town from the open countryside. He drove slowly, his knuckles tight on the wheel, scanning the flooded road ahead. The storm was one of the worst he had ever seen, and though his cabin lay several miles further, something told him to keep going. It was then, through the veil of water and shadows, that he saw her. She was crouched at the side of the road, drenched to the bone, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if the force of her will alone could fight the cold that clawed at her. Her hair clung to her face in wild strands, and though she tried to shield herself, the storm seemed determined to devour her. He pulled over instantly, his boots splashing into the rising water as he rushed toward her. "Miss, are you all right?" he called out, raising his voice above the roar of the wind. She looked up at him, eyes wide, trembling not just from the cold but from something deeper, something etched into her very soul. She didn't answer, only stared at him as if he were a figure she could not decide was real or imagined. He extended his coat, draping it over her shoulders. The weight of it seemed to break whatever wall she had built, and suddenly she clung to him, her body shivering violently against his chest. Without a word, he lifted her into his truck and turned the heater on high. She pressed into the corner, gripping the coat as though it were her only lifeline. Silence lingered between them, interrupted only by the rhythm of the wipers and the storm raging beyond the glass. "I was lost," she whispered finally, her voice shaking. "I didn't know where else to go." He nodded, not pressing her for more. Something in her eyes told him she had faced far more than the fury of nature tonight. By the time they reached his cabin, the rain had slowed, though the wind still rattled the trees. He ushered her inside, lit a fire, and wrapped a blanket around her. Only then did her lips begin to soften from their blue hue. As the warmth spread, she looked around the cabin with a mixture of wonder and disbelief, as though she had never known such shelter. Her hands, delicate and trembling, clutched the fabric to her chest. "Why would you stop for me?" she asked softly, almost to herself. "Because no one deserves to be left out there," he replied simply. His tone carried no weight of obligation, only truth. She stared at him for a long moment, her eyes shimmering in the glow of the fire. Then, as though the words tumbled out against her will, she whispered, "You'll be my first and my last." The weight of the confession stunned him. Her voice carried both fragility and a fierce determination, the kind that comes only when a heart has known fear yet still chooses to trust. He didn't fully understand her story yet, but he felt the gravity of those words press into the silence between them. She wasn't speaking of mere companionship, she was speaking of something deeper, something unshakable. He reached out carefully, brushing away a wet strand of hair from her cheek. She didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned into his touch, as if his hand anchored her against a world that had left her adrift. The storm outside raged on through the night, but within those walls, the air shifted. It was no longer the biting cold of the rain but the fragile warmth of two souls who had collided in the most unlikely of moments. He didn't ask why she had been out there, what had driven her into the storm, or why her words carried the weight of a vow. He only knew that fate had placed her in his path, and that her trembling voice, declaring him her first and last, had carved itself into his being. The fire crackled softly, the light dancing across her face. For the first time, she smiled, a small, hesitant curve of her lips that told him she was daring to believe in something more than fear. And in that quiet, storm-laced night, both of them understood that their lives had been forever altered. The storm had no mercy that night. It ripped across the countryside with a fury that felt almost personal, as though the heavens themselves had turned their wrath on the earth below. Rain battered the windshield in endless torrents, each drop sharp as glass, and the wipers worked with a frantic rhythm that could barely keep up. The man behind the wheel leaned forward, his eyes scanning the road ahead, his jaw set in the kind of determination that only came from long years of solitude. He should have stayed home. The sensible thing would have been to wait it out by his fire, a book in hand, letting the world rage outside. But something had pulled him onto the road tonight, something he couldn't name but couldn't resist either. It was that strange pull that made him slow when he saw movement through the storm's veil. At first, he thought it was just a tree branch swaying violently in the wind. But as the lightning split the sky, he saw her, small, fragile, crouched by the side of the road like a wounded bird. He slammed the brakes, heart pounding. Without hesitation, he threw open the door, stepping out into the flood that swallowed his boots instantly. The cold bit into him, but all he saw was her, soaked through, shivering, her face hidden by tangled strands of wet hair. "Miss, can you hear me?" His voice was firm but gentle, carrying above the roar of the storm. She lifted her face, and for a moment, his breath caught. Wide, fearful eyes stared back at him, eyes that held both innocence and unspeakable sorrow. Her lips parted, but no sound came. He shrugged off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. The fabric looked heavy on her small frame, but she clutched at it like it was the only thing keeping her alive. Without a second thought, he gathered her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, yet he could feel the tremors racking through her body, a trembling that went deeper than cold. Back in the truck, he set her gently on the seat, turned the heater high, and tried to offer reassurance through silence. He didn't ask questions, not yet. She sat pressed into the corner, her knees drawn up, the oversized coat swallowing her completely. For a long stretch, there was only the storm, the engine, and the steady rhythm of her shallow breaths. Finally, she whispered, "I was lost." Her voice was fragile, a trembling thread of sound, but it was enough to break the silence. He nodded, keeping his eyes on the road. He knew better than to press for more. Some truths revealed themselves in their own time. By the time they reached his cabin, the storm had calmed only slightly, but inside, warmth waited. He led her in, lit the fire, and wrapped a blanket around her slender shoulders. The color slowly returned to her cheeks, though the haunted look in her eyes lingered. She sat near the fire, her hands clutching the blanket as though it could shield her from more than just the cold. Her gaze roamed the room with a mixture of wonder and wariness. Every wooden beam, every flicker of flame seemed foreign to her, as though she had never known such shelter. After a long silence, she turned to him, her voice hesitant. "Why did you stop for me?" "Because no one deserves to be left out there," he said simply. Her eyes glistened in the firelight, reflecting a battle waged deep inside her. Then, as though the words escaped against her will, she whispered, "You'll be my first and my last." The confession hung in the air, heavier than the storm outside. He looked at her, startled, but the truth in her voice was undeniable. She wasn't speaking of a fleeting gratitude, she was giving him something fragile and eternal. He stepped closer, kneeling by her side. Slowly, carefully, he brushed a damp strand of hair from her cheek. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed as though it was the first safe touch she had ever known. The fire crackled, the wind howled against the walls, but in that moment, the storm lost its power. Two souls, once strangers, had collided, and the world outside seemed smaller for it. She opened her eyes again, searching his face. "I don't know why I trust you," she admitted softly, "but I do." He held her gaze, steady and unwavering. "Then trust that you're safe here." A small, hesitant smile touched her lips. It was faint, fragile, but it carried the weight of a new beginning. She wrapped the blanket tighter around herself and leaned closer to the fire. And though neither of them said another word, the silence between them no longer felt heavy. It felt like the beginning of something neither of them had ever expected to find. The storm eased sometime before dawn, but neither of them slept. She sat wrapped in his blanket by the fire, her eyes half-lidded, her small hands gripping the fabric as though it tethered her to this world. He sat across the room, pretending to read, though the book in his hands never moved past a single page. Every so often, his gaze would lift, watching her with quiet care. It struck him how young she seemed, not just in years but in the way she looked at the world, as though everything was sharp, new, and frightening. And yet there was a weight in her eyes, a shadow that no youth should carry. When the fire burned low, he rose to place another log. She startled at the sound, her shoulders tensing. He paused, holding her gaze. "I won't hurt you," he said gently. "I know," she whispered quickly, as though ashamed. It's just..." Her voice trailed off, leaving silence in its wake. "You've been hurt before," he finished for her. Her eyes filled, the truth too heavy for denial. She didn't explain, and he didn't press. He only returned to his chair, giving her the dignity of her silence. For a long time, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the distant groan of trees against the wind. And then, almost timidly, she asked, "What's your name?" He smiled faintly at the simplicity of the question. "Daniel," she repeated it under her breath, as though testing the sound. "Daniel." Then, after a pause, she added softly, "I'm Alara." The name suited her, delicate, almost ethereal. It felt like something that belonged to the stars rather than the broken ground she had been left on. "Alara," he said gently. "You're safe now." The words seemed to unravel her. She bowed her head, tears slipping silently down her cheeks, soaking the blanket. He watched, torn between giving her space and wanting to gather her close. In the end, she made the choice for him. Rising slowly, almost hesitantly, she crossed the room and knelt before his chair. Without a word, she leaned into him, her head against his chest. His arms rose cautiously at first, then wrapped around her with quiet strength. She trembled against him, not from cold now, but from the release of years of fear. He didn't speak, didn't try to soothe with empty words. He only held her, steady and unwavering, as though he had been placed there for this very purpose. "You'll be my first and my last," she whispered again, so quietly he almost thought he imagined it. Daniel's heart tightened at the words. He didn't yet know all they meant, but he knew their weight. She wasn't speaking of passing affection. She was offering her trust, her heart, her entire being, something she had clearly never given before. He pressed his chin gently to her damp hair. "Then I'll honor that, Alara. The days that followed were quiet, marked by small steps of healing. Alara stayed in the cabin, her presence both fragile and steadying. At first, she was cautious of every sound, every movement, as though expecting the world to turn cruel at any moment. But with time, the rhythm of Daniel's life, the steady chores, the warm meals, the calm silence, began to weave safety into her soul. She helped him with small tasks, her hands learning to chop vegetables, to mend torn cloth, to carry wood for the fire. Each act, though ordinary, seemed extraordinary to her, as though she had never been allowed such simple things. One evening, while they sat by the fire, Daniel asked gently, "Where were you heading that night, before the storm?" Her fingers stilled around the hem of the blanket she was mending. She hesitated for a long time, her lips pressed tightly together. Finally, she whispered, "Away." "From where?" "From everything." Her eyes lifted to meet his, shimmering with unshed tears. "I grew up in a house where silence was safer than speaking, where every word, every glance, could bring anger. I learned to hide, to obey, to survive." She swallowed hard. "But survival isn't the same as living. I thought, maybe if I left, I could find a place where I could breathe." Daniel's chest ached at her words. He could see the truth etched into her face, the kind of truth no one should have to bear. "You found more than a place," he said softly. "You found someone who will never let you be alone in that again." Her breath caught, and for a moment, hope flickered in her eyes, fragile but real. Dash dash dash. As winter settled in, their bond deepened. Daniel was not a man of many words, but he showed care in actions, in the way he made sure her favorite seat by the fire was always warm, in the way he taught her gently, never with impatience, in the way his eyes softened every time they met hers. Alara, for her part, brought a quiet light into the cabin. She sang sometimes, softly, when she thought he wasn't listening. Simple melodies, sweet and unpolished, but they filled the space with warmth. She laughed rarely, but when she did, it was like the storm outside could never touch them again. One night, as the snow fell thick against the windows, Daniel found her standing at the door, gazing out at the white world beyond. She looked ethereal in the glow, her hair a soft halo around her face. "Do you ever want to go back?" he asked quietly. She shook her head instantly, her voice steady. "No, that life, it's gone. I left it in the storm. And here," she turned to him, her eyes shining with tears, "here is the first place I've ever felt like I belong." She stepped closer, her hand trembling as she reached for his. When her fingers brushed his, it was as though she was placing her entire heart in his palm. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice breaking, "you're the only one I've ever trusted. The only one I want. You'll be my first and my last, always." This time, he didn't just hold her words in silence. He bent his head, his forehead resting gently against hers. "Then I'll spend my life making sure you never regret those words." Dash dash dash. The months that followed were not without challenge. The world outside their cabin still carried shadows, whispers of people who had known Alara's past, men who searched, who questioned, who wanted control over what they had lost. But Daniel stood like a shield, unyielding. His presence was enough to turn away those who sought to reclaim what was never theirs to begin with. Through it all, Alara grew stronger. The girl who had once trembled in silence now walked with quiet confidence, her laughter filling the cabin, her eyes no longer clouded by fear. She became the heart of the home they shared, and Daniel became the unshakable rock she leaned upon. On a spring morning, when the storm was only a memory and the world outside bloomed with new life, Daniel found her by the garden they had planted together. She was kneeling among the flowers, her hands covered in soil, her face lit with joy. When she saw him, she rose, brushing her hands against her skirt. And before he could speak, she whispered the words once more, her vow etched into the very air. "You'll be my first and my last." He took her hands in his, dirt and all, and smiled with the kind of love that needed no proof. "And I'll be your always." Dash dash dash. Years later, when the storms returned, they faced them together, not as two strangers, but as one soul bound in trust and love. And each time thunder shook the earth, Alara would take Daniel's hand, remembering the night it all began, the night she was rescued not just from the storm outside, but from the storm within. And every time, without fail, she would whisper through the roar of the rain, "My first, my last, my forever."